In this video, I'd like to talk a bit about inclusive communication. What do I mean by this? What I'd like to look at is how you can communicate in a way that doesn't unconsciously exclude others. So why does this matter? It matters first of all because of our values. At the University of Southampton, one of our values is that we champion equality, diversity and inclusion in all that we do. For this to be more than just a nice sentiment, it's the individual actions and choices on a day-to-day basis, both by staff and students, that will see this happen. Research argues that there's invisible structures or capital that typically advantages white middle-class students in UK universities. So I'd then ask, what invisible structures or capital might there be in group discussions that favour some people over others? We use group discussions at university to help us learn. So it's also important to have effective group discussions for effective learning. We're looking for what Morinchak calls that emergent intelligence. But, he argues, you only get this when people contribute to the same discussion at the same time. The effectiveness of the group discussion is important for us all. Another reason why it matters is as a learning opportunity. If you think of the current university environment, it's a great melting pot. And it's a fantastic opportunity to hear from different people with different perspectives. Rather than, being stuck in our echo chamber where we're just hearing from similar people who have had similar life experiences and have a similar view to the world as us, we have a chance to hear from people who have had very different life experiences or have a very different cultural viewpoint, a very different way of looking at the world. So it's a great opportunity to help to sharpen, question, challenge and build our ideas. But to be challenged and to be shaped like that, we need to have the opportunity to hear from other people. I think it's actually really important to think of the craft of group discussion. We think about maybe practicing essay writing or report writing or crafting the perfect CV. Similarly with speaking, we might want to practice a presentation or our interview technique. But what about the craft of the group discussion and how to not just project your ideas on other people, but actually to listen, to draw other people in? There's a huge amount going on there. And actually these skills be useful not just for now, but in the future. Srivastava and Prasad argue that there is a communication skills gap in the workplace. And the communication skills they found were most lacking were around talking and active listening, which they were often quite subtle and unnoticed unless you'd had direct training in it. If you think to kind of the first hurdle that some people come across, the graduate assessment centres, group tasks and group discussions to see how you interact with people are often part of those graduate assessment centres. So really it's a key skill. And that's before we look going forward into the workplace and how you will, interact with colleagues, customers. I think finally, it's also important because often this blocking is unconscious. I don't think any of us want to hold somebody out of a conversation, and yet often it happens. Okay, so let's look at a scenario. Imagine you're in a group discussion, but some students remain silent. I've actually had on a number of occasions international students come to me and ask for help to fix their speaking because they were having problems communicating their ideas in discussions with home students. As our conversation went on, however, it became clear that they didn't have particular problems in communicating, in speaking in the language of English, and there was actually something deeper going on. Similarly, Hyland argues that too many problems are blamed on international students' language, and we actually need to look at our own practice. Now, I've used the example of international students because that's who I work with. However, in our discussion about inclusive communication, I don't want us just to think about international students and home students. It's not just for this context. Actually, there's the idea within inclusive education that if you do something that's inclusive for one group, then it's inclusive for all. It has knock-on effects, knock-on benefits. And I think we can see this in another example. Cullen has looked into the experience of students on the autism spectrum. And one student recounted this experience of group work. In class, every time I'm placed in a group, slowly everyone starts to act distant and angry with me, leaving me to become the scapegoat and take the blame for anything that goes wrong, despite being a straight A student. When I contact instructors about my concerns, I'm often told to talk it out with my group, which goes nowhere. I find this experience really interesting. You've got here an apparently academically capable student, strong student, a straight A student. But we all know this experience. You're in a group and somebody is identified as being the problem. The group would be fine if it wasn't for that one person. And if you notice here, that student is being left feeling that they are the one who needs to fix that problem. They need to go and talk it out with the group. Like those international students coming to me feeling that they were the problem. So what I want to look at is these scenarios. Is it that there are some people who are just the problem and we need somebody else to fix it? Or are there things that we can do that can help to include everybody in the group and make the whole group function more effectively? So I mentioned that this blocking is often unconscious, and there are three areas of unconscious blocking that I'd like to look at: language, culture, and the self. Okay, so first of all, let's have a look at language. I think sometimes when we talk about language or think about language, we can mistakenly think of it as a single thing, English. However, it's actually thought that there are many Englishes, and this might manifest itself in different ways. For example, there might be variation in the grammar or in vocabulary or indeed in accents. I find this website from BBC World Service has 3 podcasts that are really interesting at looking at I think the southern British pronunciation and features that there are, that it talks through some of the features and can be quite helpful in understanding why at times someone who's not familiar with these accents might have difficulty in understanding what's been said, because certain sounds can be eaten, you're not hearing them, or extra sounds are added in which join words that are in print. They would be separate words, but the way we say them makes it sound like they're joined together. So that's really interesting, and actually those aren't pitched at changing the way in which people speak, but instead at making people aware of some of the features and therefore why it might be difficult at times to understand. Also, another interesting thing is the use of informal language versus academic language. So everybody's different, but some students, particularly if their first language isn't English, might find that they are more familiar with academic language, or certainly over time become more used to academic language as they have to write lots of essays and reports. Obviously it varies, depends on the individual, but that can be something that happens. However, sometimes in lectures, but also in seminars, we can see informal language being used. Now, I suppose there'll be a variety of reasons for that. Informal language can be a good way of trying to build a rapport with other people. However, sometimes that informal language is actually harder to understand than the academic language. So we need to be really careful that the informal language that we might choose to use kind of subconsciously to break down barriers and to be friendly might in fact actually cause more barriers and cause more difficulty for people. So we need to be aware of that. And of course, speed of interaction. We've already mentioned accents, and I'm sure we can all think of times when our own accent has been a problem or we've struggled to understand somebody else. Something that really helps is if you just speak slower. But we would think about this in a presentation, but it can easily be forgotten in group discussion. And then we can get on to silence. We can be very uncomfortable with silence and find it quite embarrassing, and there can be that inclination towards bouncing off each other and speaking quite quickly. Even in our own speech, we can be very reluctant to build in pauses. However, although for some people it might be embarrassing, for other people it might be necessary time to think and process and gather thoughts. Without that time, they might not feel able to contribute. Okay then, so moving on from language, so moving beyond the nuts and bolts of whether somebody understands the words and what we're saying, to actually the culture and whether where there's a lack of shared cultural context, both in terms of one-off comments, references that make sense to that are common ground and make sense, or examples and case studies. So being aware of that so we can explain where necessary and invite other people's input and insight from different perspectives. Academic culture is also hugely important, and we might not, we're often not aware of it. So this is our values, beliefs and expectations around discussions. So for example, somebody like Turner explores what's the value of talking versus silence. Are you a good student if you kind of keep throwing out ideas and externally processing them so that you can together collectively construct and develop an idea? Or should you sit in silence and reflect on different people's viewpoints until you reach the point, combine those different personalities and listen carefully? Where perhaps you might see talking just off the top of your head as, speaking without consideration might be considered a bad thing to do. This might make different people's willingness to speak or not speak be seen in a different light. Turn taking is also a cultural issue. What's the appropriate gap between speaking and taking turns? And if some people feel more comfortable having taking turns more quickly, or even speaking slightly over the last person's point, that might block out somebody else who feels they need to leave a longer gap before letting the next person speak. This flows over into features such as eye contact and body language, where we might have different ways of communicating our desire to join in the conversation or trying to connect with other people. So the last area of unconscious blocking I wanted to look at was the self. Because when we're thinking about language and things and the use of language, we can forget about the human being, the complex human being that actually is going to use the language. And tied up with choosing whether to speak or not to speak can be the sense of self and our esteem. Do we see ourselves as having value to offer and ideas to offer, and do we see that as do we feel we have the right to have a voice within that group? And this can be seen in terms of power dynamics. Now you might think, you're not going around telling other people, listen to me, I am, I'm more powerful than you, you must listen. Don't go around doing that. But there's some interesting research out there. Paige Gould found high cortisol levels in Latino students paired for discussion with white American students. However, When there was cross group friendships, so the white American students paired with some Latino students, the anxiety reduced. So I feel this research not only points to the fact that there can be power dynamics which block or reduce discussion, reduce people's ability to feel they can take part in a discussion, or at least the anxiety is there. It also shows that the situation, there are things we can do to improve the situation. Okay, so what can we do in terms of inclusive communication? I think the first thing is to slow down and consider the way we are speaking and how we're communicating our ideas in the same way that we would do in giving a presentation. Clarity is no less important in a group discussion than it is in a presentation. If anything, you could argue that it is more so because we don't have slides and visuals to back up what we're saying. People are entirely reliant on listening to us. Similarly, consider the pace of turn taking and whether you could add a longer pause when taking over from somebody else speaking. Think about the language you use. Choose the clearest word. This is good practice for science and engineering writing. And also think about whether there are any cultural references that might benefit from you giving a bit more context to them. Look out for whether you're using any blocking or monopolising behaviours. Marinchak's done some really interesting work here using virtual realities to help people become aware of these behaviours. So it's things like locking eye contact with one other person in the group, and therefore kind of excluding the others rather than sharing eye contact around the group. Marinchak points out that we usually do this because we're not aware we're doing it. So it's really important to think about what you're doing in a group discussion. Also, being a good member of the group is about being a good listener and an active listener, so taking an interest in what others are saying. It might be really helpful to look at alternative platforms for sharing ideas, so kind of online places where you could chat, writing ideas before or after the session. Some people just naturally need a little bit longer to think about their ideas, but they might then have some really interesting thoughts. It's just the session's passed. So what's to stop you setting up an online chat with some of your classmates? You might think that sounds like an awful lot of work, and we typically think of our independent learning and studying by ourselves as the times when we go off and look at research papers and books. But what if one of our greatest resources was actually those interactions and those completely different perspectives that you can have through for your peers to give you ideas to have different ways of seeing things? One of the unexpected highlights of the pandemic for me was as teaching changed to being a lot more videos and using my actual live time with students as just chats, coffee chats, and just really hearing a lot more about different students' experiences, why they come, what have motivated them to study their different programmes. And there was a number of occasions where I was speaking to a student and I thought, wow, that is hugely inspiring, and I wonder if anybody else on your course knows that, some amazing reasons why people have come and what they wanted to study and what they hope to do afterwards. So I think actually looking for ways to really use those connections and use other people's experiences and perspectives as a real melting pot that the university can be. And lastly, remember, keep going back to remember to slow down and consider clarity. The reason is we start off with good intentions, but then we forget. So keeping practicing, slowing down, coming back to that and building that habit in. And really here, as with writing, The responsibility for being understood rests on the speaker, not on the listener. One final thing to say is that I would encourage you to keep practicing and reflecting on and honing these skills. One opportunity for students studying at the University of Southampton is the Intercultural Communication Skills course that is offered by ACIS, the Academic Centre for International Students. This course is open to all of our students, home students and international students, and it's free. It's not credit bearing, so you can just do it for fun as well as learning some important skills. If you'd like to find out more about that opportunity or to book up, then please use the web link given on the slide. I'd also like to say thank you to Ros Davis and Sarah Winspear, colleagues who've helped give me some input on putting this together, as well as former colleague Jill Doubleday, who did a lot of work in intercultural communication.